everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here with a book review for The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. This is a nonfiction book that tells the story of Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks was a black woman who lived in Virginia in the early 20th century, and she died at Johns Hopkins in 1951 of, I believe, some kind of ovarian cancer. Doctors took some of her cancer cells and actually managed to keep them alive. It was the first time human cells had survived outside of the human body for an extended period of time. They multiplied, they became a lot, basically. I'm not a science person, so I'm terrible at explaining this. But essentially, her cells have survived since she died, and they've been used in all kinds of scientific research. They were flown up into space. They were in nuclear bombs. They were used for testing vaccines, and especially polio, which the polio vaccine came out just a few years after she died. And her cells, which are called HeLa cells, have been incredibly important to science. Henrietta Lacks herself was a poor, uneducated black woman who never gave consent to have those cells taken, who never gave consent to have her body used in all kinds of medical experiments. She was never compensated for this. Her family didn't know about this for years and years. They were never compensated for it either. And this book is essentially about what happened, what her cells are done, what they've been used for today, and all the injustices that she and her family have been through because of this scientific advancement. I gave this book 4 stars, and I think at its core, it's a very important book. It's a very valuable book. I feel like I gained something so important from reading this that, I would highly recommend it, because I came away feeling like this book changed me a little bit. Like, this book added something of necessary value to my life. Henrietta Lacks is someone people should know, is someone who should be a household name. And I think this book has done a wonderful thing in almost making her a household name. Of course, not everyone knows who Henrietta Lacks is, but a lot of people have heard of this book, and a lot of people know the basic story now. And 20 years ago, not that many people knew her name. It was kind of an uncommon thing to know her name, to know who she was, even though so many people had heard of HeLa cells. And I think this book has done an absolutely wonderful thing in that regard, in just telling her story, because it's something that I feel like should be told, that we shouldn't gloss over things or gloss over the people whose contributions made these scientific advancements possible, regardless of how those contributions were made. We have HeLa cells because of her. In a way, HeLa cells are her. Or I shouldn't say in a way, they're literally her DNA. But we need to talk about things like this. We need to talk about the abuses of the medical industry today also, but especially, 70 years ago when her cells were originally taken from her. And I think it's just a very important book in that regard. And I would highly recommend it just for that, just to know her story, because I do think it's important to know her story, and I think it's important for her to know her story. We need to respect her as a person after she was so disrespected by doctors and medical people and scientists for all these years, all these decades. I loved hearing the story of her life, of who she was as a person and what she went through, and not just in terms of the medical aspects and her getting cancer, although that was important as well, but just who she was, because she was a person, before she got cancer, before her cells just became what they are today. She was just a regular person who had a family and who grew up and fell in love and liked to go dancing and all of that. And I really loved hearing her story, and I loved the story of her family, because a lot of this book did focus on her children, several of whom never really knew her because she died when they were so young. And it was interesting to hear from them and see their perspectives on this, what little there was, because some of the children weren't really down with being a part of this book, didn't really trust Rebecca Skloot, which I'll get into a little bit later in the review. But that was my favorite part of this book, was just the narrative, their story, what happened to them and what they felt and what they'd been through because of all of this. I will say I struggled with the science in this book some. I am not a very scientifically inclined person. I definitely struggle a lot with science, and I struggled a lot with the science in this book. There was a lot of story and narrative to this that I liked, but sometimes it did delve just into straight science, and there would just be chapters where she would be discussing the cells and cell culture and all of these kinds of things, and it's I don't understand that. And I don't think it was bad because this is a book that kind of necessitates some just straight scientific discussion, and I think that's very important. Like, this is a book about cells. Like, you have to discuss what cells are and what her cells were used for and how they were kept alive and all of that. But I will say, most of the science did just go straight over my head. I'm not sure I retained much of it. I'm just not a science person. So that did make this book drag a bit for me, and I definitely did struggle getting through it when there were just like a couple of chapters that were just discussing cells and discussing scientific advancement. And I was like, I don't understand any of this. Like, this could be not in English and I would understand about the same amount. But if you are more scientifically inclined than me, which is like 98% of the world probably, I think you'd like it a lot more. I think you'd be able to get through it a lot more. It wasn't that it was necessarily like really heavy, dense, difficult to understand science. I just don't get science at all. So I do recommend this, but just like be prepared going in that there is like some heavy science bits. Not a bad thing, and like I managed to get through this whole book and really enjoyed it. So obviously most people can. I don't think the science is too much. It's just that it was a struggle for me, and it did definitely impact my enjoyment over certain bits. There was a lot of interesting discussion on ethics in this book that I really enjoyed. I like discussing ethics. I think it's interesting. I can't really comment on a lot of them specifically or like discuss them in depth in this review just because they are like very sciencey things. Like, oh, there's discussion on like who owns human cells? Like, does the person who like created the cells, like out of their body, do they own the cells? Do doctors own the cells? And it was like, well, the way the system is today seems not good. But as a non-scientifically inclined person, I can't really discuss this at all because I don't really understand the principles of it. Lots of interesting discussions going on, and there definitely needs to be changes in some degree. But again, I can't really comment on that. And then beyond just like the ethics discussion, there was like straight up abuses by scientists, especially back in like the 50s, 60s, 70s, what have you. Doctors injecting syphilis, doctors just straight injecting cancer into people. That was like very disturbing. A lot of them poor people, a lot of them black people, and a lot of them uneducated. And it was very, very interesting to learn about. Like, obviously very heavy, very dark, very sad and scary. There was one instance where doctors wanted to inject people at a largely Jewish hospital, or I say largely Jewish. It was a Jewish hospital, and some of the Jewish doctors just quit because they were like, this is what the Nazis did. Like, you are equivalent to Nazis in this situation right now. And it was like heartening to see that like some people were like understanding that that was, you know, eugenics and Nazis and all of that. But also like disturbing that it was only 3 of them and they literally lost their jobs over it. Because that seems like such a basic thing to just be like, no, I'm not going to inject cancer into people without their informed consent. Like, that seems like a very basic thing. Like, people literally lost their jobs for refusing to do it. And it was very interesting to read about all those things, but definitely like a struggle in terms of like, it was very dark and it was very like, wow, doctors were really doing this. Doctors really thought this was okay. But very worthwhile because like I knew some of those things. Like, it's not like any of that was a surprise to me. It was just interesting to learn about like the details and like the specifics of these cases and what happened. One of the main concerns I had about this book was kind of the author herself, because a lot of my feelings about this book are just very positive. Like, this was a wonderful book. It tells a very important story. I would highly recommend reading it just on the basis of those alone. Like, I can't really discuss too in depth about like all these things 'cause I don't know science, but the one concern I did have was kind of the author and her perspective and her motivations for doing this, because she talked a lot about like how she was like helping these people and how she just like felt for Henrietta Lacks and like how she wanted to change things and like tell this important story. And it's like, I understand, but it also felt a little bit white saviory. And at the same time, she talked about the abuses that had happened to this family and all the terrible things that like people in power had done to this family and how they'd been taken advantage of for like all these years in all these different ways, because it didn't just stop with taking Henrietta's cells and those being important and the family getting no compensation for that or not giving consent for that. It wasn't just that. Like, doctors came back to them and took blood from like the children and stuff, and it went on for a great many years, and there were a variety of things that happened. But it also seemed very strange to me, Rebecca Skloot's relationship with them, and how she wrote this book, this very, very popular book, very famous book now. I don't know how much money she made off of this book, but I would expect a good deal. And I get to the back, and it basically just says a portion of the proceeds go to a foundation for the Henrietta Lacks family, and like a scholarship in her name, and like a foundation to help other people in this situation as well. Like, it's basically just like an all-encompassing nonprofit to help people. And I was like, I really thought she was gonna give the family like a direct percentage of the proceeds. Like, that was kind of my impression from reading the book. Like, all of these people have profited off this family. This is very poor, very uneducated family. And they were taken advantage of because they were poor and uneducated and black, and they literally like didn't have the resources or the knowledge to stand up for themselves, because they didn't know what to do. Like, they didn't know what was happening. And it kind of seemed like Rebecca Skloot was doing a little bit of the same thing. Like, she was also profiting greatly off of this family. Like, this book is very, very well known. Like, it's been out for 10 years or so, and we still have like a half dozen copies in my bookstore that we just keep on a regular basis. It just seemed very questionable that she was yet another white person who came in and profited off this family. And I don't know how much money, if any, the family got from this, because I do know she set up a foundation. I do know she's given some of the proceeds, but it was also the kind of thing where it felt like if she was giving the family a large amount of the proceeds, or like a decent amount, and when I say large, I don't mean like 50%, but I mean like, 5%, 10%. That's a large amount of proceeds from this book. That she would have made a point of that. She seemed like the kind of person who would have brought that up, who would have like made a point like, hey, this percentage of the proceeds goes to the family because I'm not just another white person profiting off of them, taking advantage of them, telling their story, telling deeply personal things about them. Because that was another thing. She says a lot of very, very personal things in this book about the family, the children specifically. She talks a lot about the daughter, Deborah, and the sexual abuse she suffered when she was a child, and she talks about the son, Zachariah, who also suffered a lot of abuse at the hands of a woman who was basically, I don't want to say basically like a mother to him, but to the woman who raised him, who was very abusive towards him, and how he went to prison. And she shares medical information about some of the other children of Henrietta Lacks. And it seemed very questionable because of all those children, only one of them really seemed down with Rebecca Skloot, and only one of them seemed to support the idea of this book. And it was weird to me that she included so many personal details, and I was like, did they consent to that? Did they want you to write down all that personal information, all this abuse they suffered in this book? Like, I'm not usually one to question that in nonfiction, because, like, I don't know, like, it doesn't really come up. But when you write a book that's entirely about ethics, that's entirely about this family who's been taken advantage of by the system for so many years, by doctors, by authority figures, you come in and write this book about them, and it was like, do you have their consent to share this personal information? Like, that was a big question I had, and I just had a lot of questions about Rebecca Skloot in general. A lot of them I can't answer. I did a little bit of research, but honestly not a whole lot, mostly because I'm lazy and partially because I do feel like a lot of those things should have just been answered in the book. I do feel like books should stand on their own to a degree, and that these are things that she should have discussed in the book. She should have discussed having consent from the children to publish this information about their lives, like, while they were still alive, because a lot of them were still alive when she published this book. A lot of them were still alive when she was writing this book. And I just wish there'd been more transparency on her part. And I also wish there'd been kind of less of her in this book, because a lot of it does seem like it focuses on her an unnecessary amount when I really didn't care about her. I cared about the family and what happened to them. But I still think this was incredibly worthwhile. I highly, highly recommend, because I do think it was a really wonderful book. Let me know down below if you read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks and what you thought of it if you have. I buddy read this with Ariane over at Booksellets. I will link her review down below because that is also up, and I highly recommend you check out her thoughts on it as well. We had a great time reading this together. I think it's very worthwhile, and I would highly recommend that you check out this book as well. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.